If you've seen my review on the first Alan Wake game, then you'll know how I feel about it. But in case you haven't, long story short, Alan Wake is my favorite game I've ever played. So to say that I was excited for American Nightmare when it was released would be an understatement. I did have to temper my expectations for the game, however, as American Nightmare is not a full-on sequel to Alan Wake. It's actually a standalone spin-off according to Remedy, the developers of the game, and was originally released on the Xbox Live Arcade as a digital-only game. Remedy said during interviews that Alan Wake was about 2/3 a story experience and 1/3 an action experience, whereas American Nightmare is 2/3 action and 1/3 story. While I definitely prefer the more story-focused approach that the first game took, American Nightmare isn't a cash grab or throwaway game by any means. I played American Nightmare on PC twice for this review, once on normal difficulty and once on nightmare difficulty. This video will contain mild spoilers, you have been warned. Alan Wake was set in the Pacific Northwest, somewhere in Washington state, meaning most of the game took place in mountainous forests with large bodies of water. American Nightmare changes up the location to somewhere in the Arizona desert, complete with cacti and sand as far as the eye can see. The atmosphere that I love so much in Alan Wake isn't felt nearly as strongly in American Nightmare, but some of it is still there. The eerily quiet desert can be a bit unsettling during more extended breaks in the action, but for the most part, American Nightmare is really not a frightening experience. American Nightmare looks pretty good overall for a 10-year-old game, though much like the first game, the character models haven't really aged well. The game has a handful of live-action cutscenes which look decent, but there aren't really any cinematic cutscenes like the first game anymore. Instead, we have these in-game cutscenes which really don't look good and highlight how weird some of the facial animations can be. The game's sound design is as good as Alan Wake's. The gun sounds in particular are excellent and beefy. The voice acting is very hit or miss though. Alan and Mr. Scratch are both voiced by Matthew Peretta, and he does a great job, but some of the characters just have weak performances that sound completely unemotive and unreal. The score was still composed by Petri Alanko, but for the most part has a pretty different feel from the first game. A lot of the tracks feel moodier, with less melodic strings and orchestral touches. There's also a lot of electronic sounds in the music. Unlike the music in the first game, I haven't really found myself listening to it outside of the game, but I do think it fits in pretty well with the new aesthetic and vibe of American Nightmare. Generally speaking, the game performs very well on the technical side. I got a steady 144 FPS throughout the whole game without any noticeable frame rate drops, but there are a few technical hiccups that I encountered. Sometimes when you're having optional conversations with characters, the beginning of each audio line audibly fades in, which is something I don't think I've ever encountered in a game before. Every time at the end of arcade mode, no matter which map I was on, the screen flickers between gameplay and a blank white screen at the end of the round when the sun rises up, and the game crashed on me once. Nothing crazy, but it's still worth bringing up. American Nightmare is a spin-off taking place in an episode of Night Springs, the Twilight Zone-inspired TV show in the Alan Wake canon. After the events of the first game, Alan finds himself stuck in the dark place, struggling to find a way to escape. He writes a new manuscript, one written for the purpose of freeing himself, but his evil doppelganger Mr. Scratch is attempting to stop him by trapping him in a time loop. Remedy was pretty clear in interviews leading up to the release of American Nightmare that this game isn't really canon. I've always considered it to be the end of Alan's story if we never ended up getting a proper Alan Wake 2, which we are now getting. As I said earlier in the video, Remedy decided to take a more action-focused approach to the game, citing that a lot of the things fans wanted out of a sequel were improvements to the gameplay side of things. And while the gameplay is definitely an improvement from the first game, the story really does take a back seat here. It's not a bad story by any means, but it's much more simple and basic than the first game. There aren't any real twists or turns. There's a handful of characters in the game that you'll encounter during each time loop, of which there are 3. You can engage in optional conversations with them, which helps flesh them out a little bit, and some of the conversations are interesting in the ways they showcase how much Alan has grown and changed since the first game, and there's even a bit of philosophy thrown in as characters ponder the situation they find themselves in. But some of the writing is still kind of weird like in the first game, and again isn't really helped by some of the bad voice acting. Mr. Scratch does make for a compelling antagonist, taunting Alan by leaving tapes for him to find on televisions. Each tape shows off just how deranged and evil this game's villain really is. Aside from the TV shows, you can also find radio shows which gives us a peek into how the lives of certain characters have progressed since the events of the first game, like Barry and Alice, and of course the return of the manuscript pages. Although instead of the easy-to-read format from the first game, they now slowly scroll through the page while blurring words, making reading the pages a pain. My biggest criticisms of the first game were related to gameplay, and basically every single one of my complaints has been addressed in American Nightmare. The pace of combat feels different. It's faster and more frenetic than an already frenetic combat system. The shield of darkness that surrounds enemies can no longer be damaged simply by shining your light on them. You must boost your flashlight to damage the darkness. To compensate for this change, however, your flashlight recharges much faster than before, so it balances out nicely. Alan can actually sprint longer than a few seconds before doubling over now, and the enemy and weapon variety has been increased. You have your typical Taken that try to rush and outnumber you, who also no longer throw axes at you all the fucking time, and the possessed objects return from time to time. But American Nightmare adds a few new enemy types that help spice up the action. The Grenadier has taken it upon himself to continue the axe-throwing spirit of the enemies from the first game by hurling darkness grenades at you, a warped version of your flashbangs. The grenades do damage on any other enemies that get in the blast, so you can use that to your advantage if you find yourself overwhelmed or low on ammo. The birds have returned in a slightly different form. A flock will swarm you, only to transform into a powerful Taken who takes a decent amount of damage to kill. This enemy doesn't have a shield of darkness, so you can kill him right away. But if you happen to boost your light on him, he will disperse into the birds before repositioning and attempting to gut you again. Another enemy with a light twist is this big boy who splits into multiple enemies if you boost your light on him. Each time he splits, each version of himself gets weaker. However, numbers add up in American Nightmare, especially if you're already dealing with a pack of other Taken. And the biggest boy of all, dubbed King Hillbilly by Alan. This guy is really just a big, tanky Taken that can kill you real quick. There are a lot more weapons this time around. Whereas the first game only had one sidearm, American Nightmare has 6. The revolver, 9mm pistol, submachine gun, magnum, sawed-off shotgun, and nail gun. The primary weapons consist of the pump-action shotgun, carbine rifle, crossbow, hunting rifle, assault rifle, and combat shotgun. And of course, the flares, flashbangs, and flare guns return as well. Certain guns can only be unlocked by collecting enough manuscript pages, which gives a nice gameplay incentive to explore the levels. Each of the 3 levels in the game are like a mini open area, where you can go around the entire level whenever and wherever you want. There isn't that much to find, but the levels are small enough that it doesn't really take long to explore them fully anyways. And make no mistake, American Nightmare is a short game. I beat the game the first time around to 100% completion in about 5 hours or so, and on my second playthrough on the hardest difficulty I beat it in less than 3 hours. I don't think the game's short length is that much of an issue, considering that it's not a full-priced game and was never intended to be, and it's a pretty good experience overall that doesn't feel like a cash grab. There was a gameplay demo released years ago for what Remedy had originally envisioned Alan Wake 2 being. It's a pretty cool demo and contains quite a few ideas that eventually ended up in American Nightmare. One of those ideas being that Alan could influence reality during gameplay by completing a sort of manuscript puzzle. It's a really cool concept, but it really doesn't amount to more than a very simple puzzle that requires the player to match certain interactable objects with how they are described in a manuscript page. American Nightmare adds an arcade mode called Fight Till Dawn, which is sort of a spin on a horde mode. On normal difficulty, you need to fight off waves of Taken as you try to survive a 10-minute round, while on Nightmare difficulty there aren't any waves anymore, rather enemies just continuously spawn and item placements on the maps are changed. There are 5 maps, each one uniquely made for the mode and not just taken from the campaign. This mode is a lot of fun if you're into that sort of thing. This type of game mode isn't really my cup of tea, but I did enjoy it for what it was, and I'm sure the right person will get a real kick out of it. American Nightmare is a solid game. It's not a masterpiece, it's probably not gonna blow you away, but it's also not just some half-assed spin-off Remedy farted out for some quick cash. It's clear that Remedy cared about this game. The game's scope is nowhere near as ambitious as the first game. Its story is much more basic, even though it still has its moments. The gameplay is where American Nightmare shines the brightest, improving on the first game's combat in every way. At the end of the day, if you liked Alan Wake, you'll probably like this game. I'm going to give Alan Wake's American Nightmare an 8 out of 10. This video ended up being a little bit shorter than I thought it was going to be, but I'd rather not stretch out my videos just for the sake of it. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like, subscribing, and commenting your thoughts on the game down below. Thanks for watching.